Major Werner Pluskat had been staring at the English Channel for 4 years. Not because he wanted to, because it was his job. As commander of the 1st Battalion, 352nd Artillery Regiment, he was posted at Widderstand's Nest 62, a concrete observation bunker sunk into the bluffs above what the Allies would codename Omaha Beach. He had spent hundreds of nights scanning the same gray water, working the same firing solutions, listening to the same silence. By the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, the sea was still choppy from a storm that had battered the Normandy coast for 2 straight days. The German Meteorological Service had just reconfirmed it. Conditions unsuitable for an amphibious landing. No invasion possible for at least several more days, probably a week. Pluskat knew this. His commanders knew this. The entire German command structure in the West had been told this, so sometime around first light, roughly 5:15 in the morning by most accounts, cold, isolated, and having already made calls to higher headquarters and received answers in the calibrated language of military bureaucracy, telling him nothing decisive was happening, Pluskat raised his binoculars. It was a sweep done more out of habit than expectation. The horizon was no longer empty. Through the thinning morning mist, ships were filling the sea, ships of every size and description, casually maneuvering back and forth as though they had been sitting there for hours. There appeared to be thousands of them, what Cornelius Ryan would later call a ghostly armada that had somehow materialized out of nowhere. Ryan, who tracked Pluskat down and interviewed him at length for his landmark 1959 book, The Longest Day, reconstructed the moment from Pluskat's own account, that he stared in frozen disbelief, speechless, moved as he had never been in his life, and that in those first few seconds he knew, calmly and surely, that this was the end for Germany. Ryan was not a distant researcher, piecing the story together decades after the fact from a desk. He had been an Irish-born war correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph, and had flown over the Normandy beaches in a bomber on D-Day itself before later joining Patton's Third Army as it pushed across France, which is part of why the book he eventually wrote reads less like conventional history and more like reconstructed testimony. He spent roughly 2 years in the late 1950s tracking down and interviewing more than 700 participants from both sides of the invasion. Pluskat, among the more than 20 German veterans he located and persuaded to speak on the record, many of them for the first time since the war had ended. Pluskat grabbed the telephone and reached the duty officer at his division headquarters. "There must be 10,000 ships out there," Pluskat said. The reply on the other end has passed into the permanent record of the Second World War, that the Americans and the British simply didn't have that many ships, that nobody had that many ships. After a pause, the duty officer asked where they were heading. "Straight for me," Pluskat said. I think it's worth sitting with what those 3 words actually document, because they're not really a story about one man's bad luck with a skeptical superior. They're a compressed snapshot of an entire command system's failure, delivered over a single telephone call before a single American soldier had touched the sand. The man with the binoculars reported exactly what he could see, accurately in plain language. The man on the telephone filtered it through 4 years of institutional conditioning that had already decided what was possible and what wasn't. The fleet was real. The words were correct. The system built to receive them could not process what they meant. This is the story of that morning. Not what happened on the beaches, but what happened in the command posts and telephone lines behind them, where Germany's actual defeat on June 6th was decided hours before the first landing craft ever dropped its ramp. To understand why nobody believed Pluskat, you have to go back roughly 4 years, to the moment Germany built the propaganda apparatus it would eventually find itself trapped inside. Here is what Germany told its own soldiers in the spring of 1944, that they stood behind the most powerful defensive barrier in the history of warfare, the Atlantic Wall, a chain of concrete and steel running from the Norwegian fjords to the Spanish border, more than 3,000 miles of fortified coastline bristling with guns and laced with minefields. That was what the propaganda posters showed. That was what the newsreels told German civilians back home. That was what the radio repeated week after week in the confident tone of a power that had already won. Here is what the soldiers actually manning that wall could see with their own eyes. Long, unmanned stretches of coastline, bunkers with walls left half-finished because the cement trucks had stopped arriving, minefields with gaps so obvious that local farmers still walked the same paths through them they'd always used, gun positions aimed in the wrong direction because the crews had never received updated targeting data, a line that in many places between its strong points was defended by one man with a rifle and not much else. The gap between what Germany said and what Germany's own soldiers could see with their own eyes is where this entire story actually begins. Not because the men manning that wall were wrong to be there, but because it meant that by the time real evidence finally arrived, they had already been conditioned to distrust their own observations over the official version they'd been handed. German war industry by 1944 was already bleeding out. The Eastern Front consumed men, steel, fuel, and concrete faster than German factories could replace them. Italy was a slow, grinding drain in the south. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was steadily grinding down German production capacity itself. The Wehrmacht simply could not produce enough material to fortify 3,000 miles of coastline to the standard its own propaganda had promised. The actual construction work fell to Organization Todt, the Reich's massive civil and military engineering agency, which by 1944 relied heavily on forced and conscripted foreign labor, workers drawn from occupied France, Belgium, and further east. To pour concrete and dig positions along a coastline, most of them had no personal stake in defending, working under supervisors, racing against a deadline nobody could actually confirm. Strong points existed around the major ports, river mouths, and commanding cliff positions. Between those strong points, the Atlantic Wall was closer to a name applied to a patchwork than an actual continuous line. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood this the moment Hitler sent him to inspect the western defenses in late 1943. Rommel arrived in France carrying a reputation earned mostly against a different enemy, on different ground. The Desert Fox, the commander whose Africa Corps had spent 2 years running rings around British forces in North Africa, before finally being ground down by exactly the kind of overwhelming Allied material and air superiority he now expected to face again in France, this time with far less room to maneuver and retreat. He found something closer to a press release than a fortification, and began a genuinely frantic improvement program. Millions of mines ordered, tens of thousands of obstacles driven into the beaches. New gun emplacements poured around the clock. His men nicknamed the anti-landing stakes they hammered into the wet sand Rommel's asparagus. Rommel was operating from a specific, urgent piece of military logic his superiors either couldn't grasp or refused to accept. Having watched Allied air power annihilate German armored columns in the open North African desert, he understood with the certainty of direct personal experience that any German reinforcements moving toward a contested beach in daylight would be destroyed before they arrived, which meant, in his view, the defense had to sit on the beach itself. Every tank, every gun, every man positioned as close to the water as possible, ready to meet the first wave before it found its footing. His own superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, wanted the opposite. Hold the panzer divisions in deep reserve, let the Allies land and reveal their main effort, then crush them with one concentrated counterattack once the actual point of attack was clear. Both men had real arguments behind their positions. Hitler resolved the disagreement, characteristically, by trying to do both at once and fully committing to neither. Some panzer divisions went forward under Rommel's control near the coast, others stayed in reserve under direct OKW authority, meaning none of the reserve formations that might genuinely have reached Normandy in time to matter could move without Hitler's own personal authorization. Here's the part of this story that rarely makes it into a standard history lesson, and once you know it, the events of June 6th stop feeling merely tragic and start feeling specifically, mechanically inevitable. Allied intelligence had carefully mapped the German order of battle along the Normandy coast that spring, and it knew about the 716th Infantry Division, an understrength, largely static formation of older men reinforced with conscripted Eastern European volunteers, manning the bunkers above what would become Omaha Beach. The entire American assault plan for that beach was built around defeating this specific second-rate garrison force. What Allied intelligence did not know was that in March 1944, the 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength, well-trained formation built around veteran officers and NCOs pulled off the Eastern Front, had quietly relocated from the area around St. Lo to take up positions directly behind those same beaches. The division had been formed in France that same winter specifically by mixing fresh conscripts with a corps of combat-hardened veterans transferred west after brutal fighting in the Soviet Union. A deliberate policy meant to give newly raised formations a stiffening of men who already knew what real combat looked like. And it worked precisely as intended, which is exactly why Omaha turned out to be so much bloodier than American planners had any reason to expect. The 352nd fielded 9 full infantry battalions. It had spent weeks running live tactical exercises across the exact terrain the Americans were about to assault. Its guns had been pre-registered to cover essentially every meter of the beach below, and it appeared on not a single Allied intelligence map. According to several post-war accounts, the reason that repositioning stayed hidden may come down to something as small as a single German soldier shooting down a carrier pigeon carrying a French resistance message bound for London, a message that, among other things, apparently contained word of the 352nd's new coastal posting. 1 soldier, 1 bird, and thousands of American casualties on a beach they believed was lightly held. The Americans landing at Omaha were planning to fight a garrison. They were about to meet combat veterans instead, and the men in the bunkers above that beach, Pluscat's own artillery battalion among them, the riflemen of the 916th Regiment, the machine gun crews in the concrete pillboxes, had no idea that their own side's intelligence apparatus had failed just as completely as the Allies had, only in the opposite direction. They didn't know the fleet forming on the horizon represented something their own headquarters had already dismissed as physically impossible. It began, in a narrower sense, at 9:15 on the evening of June 5th. That was when Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer, the senior intelligence officer of the German 15th Army, intercepted a BBC radio broadcast and recognized exactly what he was hearing. As part of its nightly transmissions to French resistance networks, the BBC broadcast coded messages that sounded, to any ordinary listener, like gibberish, odd phrases, fragments of poetry, disconnected domestic announcements. Certain lines had been prearranged in advance as specific signals. 2 lines from a Paul Verlaine poem carried an agreed meaning. The first, about long sobs of autumn violins, meant an invasion was coming within roughly 2 weeks. The second, about wounding a heart with monotonous languor, meant it was coming within 48 hours, action imminent. German intelligence had actually broken this specific signaling system months earlier through captured resistance documents, which is precisely why Meyer was listening for it at all the night. A genuine, hard-won intelligence success sitting right alongside the much larger failure that would follow it within hours. At 9:15 that evening, Meyer heard the second line, understood exactly what it meant, and immediately alerted his own command, which put the 15th Army, positioned at the Pas de Calais, guarding what German intelligence was certain was the real invasion coast, on full alert. Here's the problem. The 15th Army was guarding the wrong beach. The alert did travel upward through the chain of command and did reach the 7th Army, the force actually defending Normandy, but the 7th Army's response stayed measured. The storm had only partly subsided. The meteorological service had already confirmed no invasion was feasible in those sea conditions. The Verlaine signal was logged and a heightened state of readiness issued to some units. But the full invasion alert, the one that would have moved armor, scrambled every reserve, put every man on every beach at absolute combat readiness, never came. Because every piece of logic Germany had built its entire Western defense around said Normandy simply made no sense as the actual invasion site. Even holding a prearranged warning signal that both sides had agreed meant invasion within 48 hours, the filter held anyway. That's not incompetence in any simple sense. It's what happens when an intelligence apparatus has been deceived so thoroughly about one specific thing. The Allied deception plan built around Calais, known as Operation Fortitude, that it becomes structurally unable to process correct information about anything adjacent to it. Fortitude hadn't just planted false documents in German files. It had turned Germany's own internal reasoning process into a weapon aimed at itself. It's worth understanding what Operation Fortitude actually consisted of, because the scale of the deception is what makes the German command's paralysis genuinely comprehensible rather than simply embarrassing. Allied planners built an entire Phantom Army Group, the 1st United States Army Group, stationed in southeast England, directly across the narrowest part of the channel from Calais, complete with fabricated radio traffic, simulating tens of thousands of troops moving and training, inflatable rubber tanks and plywood aircraft arranged on airfields to be photographed by German reconnaissance flights, and, in its single most audacious touch, a real, famous, and genuinely available American general placed in nominal command of this entirely fictional force. George S. Patton, sidelined from an active combat command that sprang over public controversy involving the slapping of a shell-shocked soldier in Sicily, was given command of the Phantom Army Group specifically because German intelligence rated him as America's most aggressive and capable field commander, and reasoned that the Allies would naturally save their best general for the main invasion rather than a diversion. German intelligence tracked Patton's public movements around England closely for months, and that tracking became one of the load-bearing pillars underneath the entire Calais assumption, right up until the actual invasion had already begun. In the early morning hours of June 6th, the first reports of parachute landings began reaching German command posts. Paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église on the Cotentin Peninsula, paratroopers east of the Orne River near Ranville, paratroopers south of Carrington. Phone lines across Normandy lit up with confused, fragmentary reports of scattered American and British soldiers moving through fields and hedgerows in the dark. By 11 minutes past 1 in the morning, General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, had accumulated enough of these reports to understand something genuinely large was underway. He reached Army Group B headquarters, where General Hans Speidel was standing in for his own commander. His commander wasn't there. Field Marshal Rommel, the one man who had argued consistently and passionately that the first 24 hours were Germany's only realistic window to stop an invasion outright, had left France 2 evenings earlier. The storm had convinced him the invasion was still days away at minimum, and he was driving home to Herrling in Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday, and to argue, in person with Hitler, for more panzer divisions positioned closer to the coast. The man whose entire defensive philosophy depended on being present and ready for the invasion's opening hours was sitting in a staff car in Germany while the invasion fleet crossed the channel. When Pemsel reached Speidel at 1:11 a.m. and laid out what he was seeing, he told him plainly, by his own post-war account, that he was convinced this was the large-scale operation. He was told to wait and see. Speidel's own assessment was that the parachute drops were probably a raid, or the preliminary phase of a diversionary operation tied to the invasion everyone still expected at Calais. That this might be the opening act, with the real main event still to come, probably at Calais, probably within days. Pemsel pushed back. The system heard him and classified it as excessive concern from an understandably cautious staff officer. While that telephone argument played out, something happening in a Norman farmyard captures German readiness that night better than any single intelligence report could. General Edgar Feuchtinger commanded the 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored formation within realistic range of the invasion beaches. His tanks were fueled. His officers were awake. The sound of aircraft and explosions had been rolling across the countryside for hours, and any experienced combat officer could read the scale of what that meant. The 21st Panzer was the one formation that might genuinely have disrupted the Allied airborne troops while they were still scattered across the dark fields, before they'd consolidated their drop zones and secured their objective bridges. Fürstinger couldn't move it. The 21st Panzer answered to Army Group B, Rommel's command, and Rommel was in Germany. Every request to move went instead to Speidel, and Speidel's answer stayed the same: wait and see. The one armored division positioned to respond immediately to an invasion sat idling in a farmyard while the battle it existed to answer unfolded roughly 20 miles away. Layer one more detail onto that same morning. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the 7th Army, had scheduled a formal command post war game exercise for the morning of June 6th itself. The scenario, by pure coincidence, an Allied amphibious landing in Normandy. His senior divisional and corps commanders had been ordered to travel to Rennes in Brittany to rehearse exactly the response they would need to the invasion of the very beaches now actually being invaded. Several of them were already on the road when the paratroopers started dropping and had to turn their cars around in the dark and drive back through the Norman countryside to reach commands already under attack. The German army was, quite literally, rehearsing D-Day on the morning of D-Day, 60 kilometers from the actual coast. And then there's the man who was asleep. Adolf Hitler had taken his usual sedative on the night of June 5th, and his physicians and inner circle operated under standing orders not to disturb him except in an absolutely confirmed emergency. Reports kept arriving at OKW through the night, parachutists, then fleet sightings, then landing reports from multiple beaches, and each one was processed through the same governing assumption. This is the expected Normandy diversion. The real attack at Calais is still coming. Do not overreact. Do not wake him. The one man who held personal authorization over Germany's strategic panzer reserves, the armored formations that were Germany's only realistic instrument for a genuinely decisive counterattack, was asleep. His senior operations officer, General Alfred Jodl, reportedly told officers requesting release of those reserves that morning a sentence that would become one of the defining lines of the entire campaign, that the Führer had not yet made a decision. Hitler was finally briefed around noon, by which point the phrase Normandy diversion had already curdled from a working theory into something closer to a catastrophe. Corporal Karl Wegner was 19 years old when he wrote home to his mother that May. He served in the 716th Infantry Division, the unit that was supposed to be the only German formation on the bluffs above Omaha. What he wrote wasn't heroic. It was simply honest. He knew exactly how much concrete was missing from the wall the newspapers back home called indestructible. He would be dead within 48 hours of the invasion beginning. Men like Wegner deserved to be remembered as more than a footnote, as people who saw the actual situation clearly, wrote down what they saw, and paid the full price for being right at a level of the command chain with no authority to act on it. Along the entire Normandy coast, from the base of the Cotentin Peninsula to the mouth of the Orne, German forward observers were picking up their phones that morning and having nearly identical conversations. Multiple sources, independent positions, entirely consistent reports. The sea is full of ships, more than we were told was possible. They're heading for the beaches. Every one of those reports climbed the same chain and met the same filter. This cannot be the main invasion. This cannot possibly be the scale being described. Something in these reports must be wrong, because the fleet was real, and the filter had been built not to protect the truth, but to protect an existing belief. Consider General Erich Marx that same morning. Marx commanded the 84th Army Corps, the formation directly responsible for defending the Normandy beaches, and walked on a wooden prosthetic leg. Soviet artillery had taken the real one near Ukraine in June 1941, while he commanded the 101st Light Infantry Division, a wound that also cost 2 of his 3 sons on the Eastern Front in the years that followed. He had recovered and returned to active duty when a quieter posting away from the front would have been available to him, and by the assessment of officers who served under him, he was among the sharper military minds in the entire German order of battle. Notably, one of the very few senior commanders who had argued, against the consensus of his own colleagues, that the Allies might genuinely land in Normandy rather than at Calais. He'd been largely ignored on that specific point. June 6, 1944, happened to be his 53rd birthday. Called back from the war game exercise in Rennes, he reached his command post at St. Lo as the naval bombardment was building toward full intensity, looked at the situation map, and began issuing orders without the hesitation that had paralyzed most of his fellow commanders that morning. Historians of the campaign have specifically credited him as one of the first senior German officers to react decisively and without delay. He wanted the 21st Panzer moving toward the beaches immediately. It was still under Army Group B, still waiting on authorization that had to pass through Speidel, who had to reach Rommel, who was still in Germany. By the time that authorization chain actually delivered a decision, the window Rommel himself had identified as Germany's only real opportunity had already closed for good. 6 days later, on June 12th, while inspecting the front near St. Lo, an Allied fighter bomber spotted Marx's staff car. A 20-millimeter round tore through his groin and severed a femoral artery, and he bled out in a roadside ditch within the hour. One of the more capable German commanders on that coast, dead before the battle he had correctly predicted, was even a week old. Down on the beaches, for a handful of hours that morning, Germany was genuinely winning at Omaha. The 352nd Infantry Division, the veterans who appeared on no Allied intelligence map, performed exactly what Rommel's doctrine demanded of them. Their weapons were pre-registered to every meter of sand below, and when American landing craft dropped their ramps, machine guns opened into men who hadn't yet reached solid ground. 27 of 32 amphibious D.D. Shermans, meant to give the infantry armored support, had flooded and sunk in the rough seas, well short of the beach, leaving the infantry to wade ashore through chest-deep water carrying 60 or more pounds of equipment directly into the most effectively positioned defensive line on the entire invasion coast. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed at Dog Green Sector and ceased to exist as a functioning combat unit within roughly 10 minutes. 5 of its 6 landing craft dropped their ramps directly in front of German machine gun positions. For those first couple of hours, a man in one of those bunkers, watching Americans pinned on the sand below, unable to advance, might genuinely have believed the defense was holding. Then a handful of Allied destroyer captains, watching the slaughter from offshore, made a decision no doctrine had authorized, and their own hulls were never designed to survive, steaming directly toward the beach, some closing to within 800 yards and scraping their keels on sandbars, turning 5-inch guns on the German bunkers at nearly point-blank range. Destroyers like USS Frankfurt and USS Karmic moved in close enough that their gunnery officers could pick out individual German positions, by eye rather than by coordinate. Firing over open sights at ranges, naval gunnery training had never anticipated using against a fortified coastline. It wasn't in any operation order. It was men looking at what was happening and deciding to act anyway. And that improvised, unauthorized fire, repeated by multiple ships along the Omaha sector, began systematically tearing apart fortifications the morning's planned bombardment had already failed to touch. By mid-morning, the 21st Panzer had finally received authorization to move, hours after Rommel's own window had closed, straight into a sky Allied air power now owned completely. The Luftwaffe, which Goering had personally guaranteed would contest any invasion, flew roughly 319 sorties over the whole of Normandy on June 6th. Allied air forces flew something close to 14,600. That's a ratio approaching 46-1. Not a gap, a chasm, and every road, bridge, and crossroads in Normandy sat under aircraft the German Air Force had no real way to challenge. The 21st Panzer did manage a brief, genuinely dramatic breakthrough near Caen, threatening for a few hours to split the British and Canadian beachheads apart before it was hit from the air and the sea, found itself without infantry support or fuel reserves, and stalled, the single German counterattack of the entire day demonstrating, at real cost, precisely what Rommel had been arguing for months. Without air cover and without being positioned in advance, an armored response to an already established beachhead wasn't a counterattack at all. It was a lesson. By midday, 3 separate systemic failures were running in parallel through the German command structure. None of them failures of individual courage or tactical skill, failures built directly into the architecture of the system, long before the invasion fleet ever appeared. The panzer reserves that might have mattered, Panzer Lehr, the 12th SS Panzer Division, were never released in time because their release required Hitler's personal authorization, and Hitler had been asleep at the one moment that authorization was most urgently needed. The command structure itself, requiring a single man's sign-off for every major strategic decision, had simply made that man unavailable at precisely the hour the decision mattered most. And the language, moving up the chain all morning, heavy landings on multiple beaches, significant Allied pressure, serious situation developing, was correct, professional, and completely inadequate to what was actually happening, because there was no standard military vocabulary for an entire 4-year defensive concept being invalidated before noon. Pemsel, who had said at 1:11 a.m. that this was the large-scale operation and been told to wait and see, was by mid-morning no longer using measured professional language in his own reports. By his post-war account, words like irreversible and catastrophe had started appearing in what he sent up the chain. Rommel reached Army Group B headquarters at La Roche-Guyon late on the evening of June 6th, having driven the entire way from Herrlingen while the largest amphibious battle in history was decided without him. Different accounts record his reaction with slightly different wording, but the substance holds steady across all of them. He reportedly repeated a single German word, dumb, stupid, foolish, several times on the drive back. He had argued for months that the first 24 hours were everything. He'd not been present for a single one of them. He had barely 2 months left to command anything at all. Badly wounded on July 17th, when an Allied fighter strafed his staff car near Saint-Foy de Montgomery, he was recovering in Germany that October when he was implicated, almost certainly wrongly in any direct operational sense, in the plot to assassinate Hitler, and was given a choice between a public trial that would have destroyed his family's safety and a private suicide dressed up afterward as death from his wounds. He took the second option on October 14th, 1944, 4 months and 8 days. After the morning he'd spent driving back from a wife's birthday celebration to a battle that had already been lost without him. By midnight, the Allied beachhead in Normandy was secure. The day's cost ran to roughly 10,000 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, across 5 beaches and multiple airborne drops. On Omaha alone, where the 352nd had made the Americans pay more dearly than at any other landing that day, U.S. losses ran close to 2,000 men, against roughly 1,200 German casualties in that same division, something close to a fifth of its total strength gone in a single day. At Utah, American forces suffered fewer than 200 casualties against a far weaker static division. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian troops pushed inland against defenders who lacked the 352nd strength and preparation. And the fleet Pluskett had described at dawn as 10,000 ships and been asked, in effect, whether he'd been drinking, was still there that night, unloading men and material wave after wave, with no German force left capable of interrupting it. The forensic verdict on that morning, as seen from inside the German bunkers, isn't primarily a story about failed soldiers. The men of the 352nd fought with genuine skill and ferocity. The defense of Omaha in its opening 2 hours was, by any honest tactical measure, briefly successful. It's a story about failed systems, an intelligence apparatus so thoroughly deceived by Operation Fortitude that it couldn't process contradictory information even when that information arrived in the form of 7,000 ships, a command structure that required a sleeping dictator's personal signature to move armored reserves, a meteorological service whose forecast became, without anyone intending it, a strategic blind spot, a chain of command in which wait and see was the answer given at 1:11 in the morning to a report reading, "This is the large-scale operation." Every one of those failures expressed itself in the end as language, as accurate words spoken and simply not believed, as precise reports climbing through a system engineered to hear only one particular answer, as a duty officer, half-jokingly asking if the man describing the largest naval force ever assembled had been drinking. Werner Pluskat survived the war. He surrendered to American forces near Magdeburg on April 23, 1945, alongside Lieutenant General Kurt Dittmar, after slipping away from the collapsing remnants of the 12th Army in the war's final chaotic days. He later served as one of the military consultants on the 1962 film adaptation of Ryan's book, working alongside a cast that included John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, and Henry Fonda, on a production Ryan himself supervised for historical accuracy. In a French television interview filmed in 1964, standing on the bluff above the same beach on the invasion's 20th anniversary, Pluskat stated plainly that he had been the first German officer to actually see the Allied fleet approaching. He lived until June 11, 2002, 89 years old with 58 years to sit with that one phone call. I don't think the honest answer to what German soldiers actually said, watching D-Day begin from inside their own bunkers, is that they said the wrong things. Pluskat said there were 10,000 ships heading straight for him. Pemsel said, correctly and immediately, that this was the large-scale operation. Marx reached his command post and started issuing orders at exactly the speed the situation demanded on his own 53rd birthday, 6 days before it killed him. The soldiers in the concrete emplacements above Omaha did precisely what they'd been trained to do, and did it competently enough that for 2 hours the actual outcome was genuinely in doubt. None of it turned out to be enough, not because the words these men used were wrong, but because the system built to receive those words had already decided, years before the fleet ever appeared on the horizon, what kind of answer it was allowed to hear. If your father or grandfather served anywhere in the European theater during the Second World War, American, British, Canadian, German, any of the nationalities present in Normandy that week, I'd genuinely like to hear their story in the comments. Whatever piece of it survives in family letters or photographs or the things they never quite talked about, because that's the part of this history no official archive can ever fully replace.